Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Condo Solutions, Monday mornings, 9 to 10 o'clock, where I try to answer your questions about condos, HOAs, and other interesting things relative to the condo world. My name is Mark Breckville. I'm a local CPA and a licensed community association manager, along with Peter Mullengarden, who's our attorney and has been dealing in this industry for a number of years and has now a specialty in this area now that that's available, and is been handling condo law for a number of years. We're a community service program. We're here to answer your questions and to try to get you some help if you need it, or just to get you some clarification. We do caution that with all of the information that we have here, we give you the best information that we can, but we can't always give you all of the correct legal information because we don't have your documents, and your documents can change the answers. For that reason, we give you what we call a radio answer, which means that it's based on the laws, common practices, and other issues, other areas that are typical for the industry, and based upon your interpretation of the documents. But if you're getting ready to go to court on something, please, contact Peter and get with him, let him look at your documents and make sure that the answer stays the same. Otherwise, everything else is pretty much fair game. We ask that you, when you call in, you give us a name. You don't have to give us your actual name, but you give us a name. Again, we don't want your association because we don't need to. It doesn't help with the answer because we don't have your documents anyway. So for that reason, we kind of just try to keep it general. And also it allows us to kind of answer the question broader, so that if there's somebody that's got a similar question, hopefully we can hit that answer as well. So we're going to get started. Good morning. Good morning, Peter. How are you this morning?
I'm well, Mark. Good. How are you?
Good. We got a caller this morning, so we'll go right to it here with the first caller. John, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I have a question on the reserve account.
Okay.
I don't know if it makes a difference if it's a condominium or a homeowners association.
Yes.
But
yes, it would.
Okay, well then this is a condo.
Okay.
And it's we currently have dedicated, I guess they call it straight line reserve accounts. So they're all assigned to a specific item.
Mm-hmm.
And they're talking about pooling it into one big pool. Now I happen to know an underwriter, and he mentioned that this is not a good idea because lending institutions kind of frown on it. They don't like to lend to condominiums that put all their eggs in one basket. I wanted to get your opinion.
Well, pooling is a legal method to maintain reserves. There's two ways to do it. You can do it on a straight line, where every account stands on its own, and you can do it by a pool where you still have the same straight line items, except it's in a pool, so all or any portion of the money can be used for any of the items that are in the pool. Now, in my opinion, and many others, to go from a straight line to a pool, you would need to get the consent of the owners to create the pool. And then once you're in the pool, it is funded, based on the same kind of formula. Although theoretically, you can actually put in less and still be fully funded. If you look at the formula, and it's a little hard to do that on the radio and show how that works. I have not heard, quite frankly, that lenders, financial institutions are less willing to finance purchases in a pooled system condominium rather than a straight line. I know that Mark and I, do have some concerns, but I've heard reserve analysts, quite frankly, on the other side of the aisle, so to speak. On the pool, one of my concerns is because in a pool, in order to be fully funded and for it to work out, you really have to be very accurate in your estimates of the estimated life and the amount it's going to cost to replace or repair the items in the pool. Because if you're off on one or two, then it throws off the whole pool. In a straight line, if you're off on one, it doesn't affect the others. Even though you're in a pool, you're putting in less. So that's kind of a long answer to your question. I know Mark has his own issues on this from the accounting side, but that's the 2-minute answer to your specific question about the financing.
Is Mark there today?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's your answer?
Well, John, I a couple things. One, your first question about the lending. No, the banks don't care because they're not using the collateral, the reserves as collateral. They're using assessments as collateral. So all they care about is that 10% of your total assessments are going to reserves, and that those reserves.
Well, wait. Do you mean borrowing money, or do you mean the fact that they're going to finance purchases, or both? As far as the banks,
I'm talking about if somebody wants to buy my unit. I've spoken to one I know, and I've spoken to 4 others. So I've spoken to 5 underwriters. They all say the same thing, and they said what you just said is the pool. You got to be really accurate, and with the straight line, you can be off on one, but the others. And what they do is they actually send. As you guys know, they send out the letter. And they ask these questions, and they'll say, how much do you put away for your reserves? And they also ask, how are the reserves structured? So they're getting a little more in depth these days.
Okay. Yeah, but pooled.
Mark, go ahead.
Yeah. So first of all, that questionnaire that goes out is different for every bank. You always want to push back on some of this stuff because they ask stuff they don't even know what they're asking. And then when you push them on it, you find out that they're not really required to ask that question. So first of all, kind of stick with that. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are what count. Okay. Underwriters tend to, for mortgage brokers, tend to try to guesstimate what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are going to ask. And so then they ask you the question. Well, that's not what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac needs to know. They want to see 10% of your total assessments going into reserves. So they want to see you've established reserves. You got 10% going in. Now, they don't care whether it's pooled reserves or it's straight line reserves or it's frankly a general reserve, because all they want to see is you've set that money aside and it's there. Frankly, for them, general reserves are better because it means you can use it on anything. If you've got straight line reserves and you're short on your roof, you either got to take a vote to move money out of other reserve accounts, or you've got to have a special assessment. And that's what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are trying to avoid, is the special assessment that the borrower can't pay and pushes the unit into default. So for them, they're just wanting to see that money's going into reserves. They actually don't even care that your reserves are fully funded. I had a condo not too long ago. They were fully funded on their reserves. They were not putting any more in because they were fully funded. And Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac was turning down a loan for a purchase in the community because they weren't providing 10% of their assessments for reserves. And the property manager, go ahead.
May I interrupt? I'm sorry.
Sure, no, go ahead.
Doesn't Fannie Mae have a threshold of 40%, no more than 40% rentals, non-occupied owner units?
Actually, it has been lower than that. It has been about 25%. Maybe
you say there's a law. You say you got to go by the law A, B, and C. So you were just whipping it off a minute ago. What does Fannie Mae say in the law as far as their underwriting requirements for renters?
It's not law.
There is no law. This is just something that they
regulation.
Yeah, it's their guidelines.
It's their internal stuff,
and they're changing right now. But it's been 25%. So if more than 25% of your community now. Here's the.
So that's a lower threshold, of course, than 40%. But the problem with our community, and I didn't want to get into the woods, but we turned into a rental community after the bust.
Right.
Over the last 5 years, we went from like 25% up. We're almost over 50% now. So we're having a hard enough time getting people that we need cash. If they don't have cash, and if they have cash, they can ask whatever they want. So our prices are literally $100,000 below what they should be selling for comps in the area.
Sure.
So with this pool, to me, it's a harebrained idea because there's so much room for abuse. You have to be extremely accurate. I know the formula. You divide it by 7.7 years, and it's all, to me, it's
wait. What's
I'm not sure where that came from.
What's 7.7 years?
Well, we have to, because of our reserves being severely underfunded, and our elevators are now and need of repair. 2 of them have to be replaced immediately. They wanted to. They're going to do a special assessment, and on top of that, they want us to vote. Of course, we got to vote on this, and we got to get 66% to vote to say we're going to move it over to pools. But the problem is, all our other reserves are already underfunded. They won't show us the study they did a couple of years ago. They don't want to show us how bad the news is. They won't even give us a figure if we ask them orally. But we're already in the hole. And so they came up with they sent out a letter, or they're going to be sending out a letter, and they have on there a formula for the pool reserves. And it's kind of a complicated thing, as Peter was mentioning earlier. But if you come up to some figure, like if you need X amount of dollars in column A, you have to times it by, I think it's 5 times. You come up with that amount. You add it all up. You divide it, and then you divide it. You divide it to get a number, and you divide that number by 7.7 years.
Now that's here. I can tell you how you calculate a pooled reserve, and this is why I don't like pooled reserves, because nobody knows what they're doing, and they end up estimating. I hate pooled reserves. I mean, there's tax problems with them too, but you end up nobody estimates the numbers correctly. Because you can't. You just can't be right on everything. So they get the numbers wrong. So they're grossly underfunded over time. Second of all, they take and spend money that they did have put aside for something that they knew was going to happen, and they spend it ahead of time, and then they don't have the money to do what had already been funded. And then the third thing about it is nobody knows how to calculate it. And the calculation is as simple as this. You are supposed to take and estimate how much it is going to cost to replace each item, and over the number of years that it's going to cost to replace that item, however often that's getting replaced. So let's say, for example, that you're going to paint every 7 years, okay? Then every 7 years, you have to plug in the cost of painting. You cannot factor in inflation. That's a state issue, unfortunately. So that's another reason. So you're not factoring in inflation. So 14 years from now, when you put that second paint job in there, it's not going to cost the same as it did 7 years before that, but that's what you have to do when you do your calculation. Now, you have to then do that calculation, put in the painting every 7 years for as long as the longest item in your pool. So if the longest item in your pool is 20 years for a roof, then then you've got to go out at least 20 years. So you've got to replace that painting job at least 3 times. So that's where people don't do it right. And they end up with a rising pool amount, which you're not allowed to do. You are not allowed, under Florida statutes, you're not allowed to have a balloon payment in your reserves, which means that your reserve amount, your assessment, cannot increase over time in your pool. It's not supposed to happen. That's not allowed.
Well, what they did, Peter, if I may interrupt, is they used the weighted average life. And what they did was what you just said. So, for instance, if we have an account that says pool area and furniture, and it says $20,000, they times it by what they thought the life expectancy was on that, which was 18 years. They didn't times it by the roofs, which is the longest item, which we have down at 30 years. So are you saying they should have times it by 30 years?
No, what I'm saying is they have to take and put it in the pool, show a replacement of it in the pool every number of years that item is expected to last.
Okay, but what was the point about the longest item?
It has to be done. You have to figure that calculation out until you've replaced the longest item one time. So if you've got an item that's got a 25-year life in your pool, you have to replace everything else for the number of times that it would have to be replaced over 25 years to do your calculation. All right? So you don't just do it once.
So let's say the longest item is 24 and the shortest item is 8. You would have to do the 8 times 3 to get the 24.
Yes, you'd have to do the 8 3 times to get to 24. Yes. Right.
Yes.
So that's...
They basically did that with this, but it's in a different manner. And I don't know. I'm not an expert on the weighted average life.
And this is Mark. I'll tell you, this is the other thing they do. That's all right. This is the other thing they do. And again, I've seen as a CPA every game these people can play with this thing, and I hate it. But here's what they're going to do too. They've got a reserve study. All right. Now they do not have to put every item in the reserve study in the pool. That's not required. In fact, you shouldn't do that. That's not right, because the reserve analyst is going to allow for the replacement of a number of items. A lot of those items will be replaced through normal maintenance. So you're not going to reserve for those items. In fact, you're only required to reserve for something that has a value of $10,000 or more and a life and a replacement or a life longer than a year. So,
and all of our reserves do this, have that.
Well, but here's the thing. So what happens when you do these reserve studies is that you're allowed to group things as systems, all right, and put them together. So there, or you can split those items back apart. So the example I always use is, let's say you've got 3 pumps on the property. You got a pool pump, a spa pump, and you've got a pump for the sprinkler system. Well, you could group all those and say pumps, and then those have got to be in your calculation. Or you could say, no, we're going to call it a spa pump, a pool pump, and a sprinkler pump, and those are all less than $10,000, so we're not going to reserve for them. All right. Now, here's what happens. The pump goes out on the spa, and it's $6,000, right? So all of a sudden they say, well, yeah, that was in the pool. Yeah, that was in the pool. See, this thing says pool maintenance, that was in there. So then they put it in so that they can use the money from the pool. And then after they've done that, next year in the calculation, they say, we took it out because it's less than $10,000. So
unbelievable.
Yes. And the state is cracking down on a little bit, but the thing is that everybody is going to these things because it does result in lower assessments, primarily because people do it wrong, but also because if you even do it right, it does level your assessments is what it does. And depending upon where you are in that process, now where you're at in that process, it should not, it probably would not reduce your assessments unless you're doing special assessments and, putting stuff in ahead of time because, you guys are already behind.
This calculation says that the annual contribution amount will be half out of the straight line segregated method if they use the weighted average method. And to me, I know what you're saying, and I appreciate it, but I'm old school, and to me, this is just creative financing because it makes it appear, like you just said, and it might, if it's done correctly, lower the assessments because you're spreading the risk. But, I've seen risk spread before, and we all went through 2008 in the real estate market. And I just think if you dedicate each reserve to what it belongs to and you fund it correctly, and I know you said something about, I didn't know the state says you can't factor in inflation, but
right.
There's no law that says you can't do it, right?
Yes, there is. There's a statute that says you can't do it.
That is crazy.
Right. The state, I fought with the state on this. I don't know why. Or the FICPA, the CPAs have fought on this. We don't understand why. There's no requirement that there's a reserve study. And here's the other thing. There's no requirement that it's fully funded. When this was put into effect initially.
Well, there is unless you waive or partially fund.
Right. But when this was put in initially, our understanding as CPAs, when we were talking to the division, was that they were going to allow it, but they recognized the risk of it. And so they were not going to allow partial funding. They weren't going to allow you to waive full funding, but they did. They never stopped that. So now what you've got is grossly underestimated numbers, lower than, and then people say, well, we're close, so let's partially fund it. Let's not fund the full amount this year. And that's just crazy. I mean, because now you're partially funding. It's one thing if if you're looking at individual items and for sure that you've got a little bit of extra money here or whatever, and you can make it through a year. But when you've got this pool of items and anything can go wrong and anything can have to be replaced, and now you're partially funding the whole thing. I mean, that's just, that has special assessment written all over it. And in a community like yours, where it's primarily rentals, you will have tons of vacancies. And at that point, that's what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are going to have problems with, is that you've got such a high rental community that that there's where they're going to have a problem, because they know if you get a special assessment. And would they look at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac still is on their 10% contribution level, but that's where some of these other underwriters are starting to try to look at things, because Fannie Mae is starting to ask questions.
So maybe the underwriters I spoke to, because I got into more detail with them, because it's an isolated incident, maybe. But for our community, they're saying, because you're already almost over 50% renters, this pool method using a weighted, what is it called? Weighted average life. Is that the basic computation, or are there more computations to figure out a pool?
Well, no, you're supposed to use the actual life of that item. First of all, you're supposed to identify the item that's going in the pool, specifically identify it as to what it is. If it's a group of items, what they are. Now, if it's a group of items, they may have an average life, and you be using a weighted average life. So, for example, if it's in the pool pump scenario I was talking about, if there's 3 pumps in there, and you've got one 6,000 and the other 2 are 3,000 a piece, okay, and the $6,000 pump has a 3-year life, and the 2 $3,000 pumps have 4-year lives. You're going to weight that average and come up with a weighted average number every years that is. So if that came out to 3 years, 3 years, and then you're going to replace that system every 3 years. So that's.
Well, I know what you mean. I mean, all they did was the replacement cost times what they're estimating the life to be.
Right.
That's what they use.
Right.
They added it all up.
And they're probably doing it right.
Up, they got a large figure, and then they divided it by what the required funding was.
Yeah, and it sounds like that they they may have done the calculation correctly. I mean, it sounds like they're putting systems together. I don't know without seeing it, but it's still going to end up with a problem. I mean, nobody can do these right, because you cannot possibly estimate the amounts right every single time, and you're not allowing for reserve or for inflation. Now, what a lot of people say is, well, we allow you to leave interest in the reserve category to cover the inflation. So if you're investing this money, then you're going to get an interest, and then that interest will cover inflation. Well, that's great if you're fully funding it, and you're funding it when you're supposed to over the item itself. But if the whole purpose of this is to have lower reserves or lower reserve payments, then you're not going to have as much interest, and you're going to be even further behind. So
exactly.
Yeah.
And we're underfunded as it is.
Yeah.
And we have to replace all our elevators. We got 14 buildings, and we're in a hole, and they want to do it over 3 years, and they want to do 2 of them right up front with a special assessment. So they're just driving owners like me out of this community. Yeah. which means more investors are going to come in, and more renters are going to come in.
Now, I will say one thing, John, about because this is confusing about rentals. I mentioned it's 25%, but believe it or not, that answer is not an easy one, and your property manager or your person that's handling it has to know how to answer that question when they send you that questionnaire.
Well, I'm sorry. I know you're a property manager, Mark, but our property manager is totally incompetent, and she's been there for a decade.
Well,
the reason why our reserves are in such a mess and our community became a rental property is because of the manager.
Yeah, well, that happens sometimes. Although I know what you mean. And it's also a sign of the times too. I'll tell you that a lot of these places are struggling because there is no housing. A lot of the young people don't want to buy anymore. And even the older people that lost some of their homes in the recession, they're not eager to buy now. They're yeah. So I understand what you're saying, but I just for the other people out there that may be in this situation. The answer to that question is when they ask how many rentals do you have, or what percentage are rentals. It's the amount of people renting at that time and that can be a big difference between that and season. And it doesn't make any difference if it's traditionally been rented at season. If it is not rented when they ask the question, there's nobody occupying it at that point as a rental, then it is not a rental. So you got to look at that, because we do have a lot of seasonal occupancy. People don't always come down here, and they rent out their unit for the season, and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac really isn't as concerned about that. They're more concerned about the ones where the units are fully rented out for 12 months, and you got 30 or 40% of your association that's fully rented out. So there is an answer to that question that you have to be careful of, because the way they ask the question, it doesn't clarify that. But they're really not, unless it's January. And then if it's January and you're answering the question in January, well, then you might have more than 25% rentals. So it's very date specific. So that's all.
When they created pool accounts, though, didn't they usually just do one major, two minors, just to spread the risk? Instead of putting all the eggs in one basket, you might have 4 pool accounts in your total. If you had 12, let's say, accounts, and you divide it by 4.
No, it was done pretty much, and it wasn't done that long ago. But it was pretty much you could have your reserves line item or pooled, and there was really no in between. There was no in between. Now, some associations do, and not that many, will pool some and straight line others, but most are either all or nothing. Either they're all in a pool or they're all in straight line.
What I meant, though, is it would all be in pool accounts. None would be straight line, but you'd divide it by, if you had 12 accounts, you'd make 3 pool accounts, and you might have 4 items in each pool account, or you might have 3, and then you do 4 different pool accounts.
I see what you're saying. Generally, John. Generally, I really don't see that. It's all the items, whether it's 4, 3, 7, whatever, are typically all in the pool or all out of the pool.
And that's a problem, John, from a tax standpoint. You need to pull any non-capital reserves out of those pools. So, for example, you do not want to have a pool that includes painting, because if you do, you've tainted your reserves for tax purposes.
Oh, boy.
And you could have all of your reserves be taxable. So
how do you define, what's a good definition for that, so I can explain this to the board? Because I know what it means. A painting isn't a capital product, but is it as simple as that?
It's basically as simple as that. If something is a maintenance item, and it's not a capital item, like balconies or whatever, those roofs.
The paint is a service, whereas a roof is actual physical tile, and maybe that's the capital difference.
Well,
you got to understand, I'm dealing with 90-year-old people.
Yeah,
on
the difference is that a painting has, by IRS code, generally, in almost every circumstance, painting has been deemed to be a maintenance item, a non-capital item. So you don't have to capitalize it, and you get to deduct it. And that's been proven by a bunch of court cases in and out of the condo world. So generally, like I said, there may be an exception to it, but generally, that needs to be pulled out separately, because for tax purposes, if you file an 1120, which you may want to do. We've got a 30% tax rate right now for H's, and we're down to for 1120s, we're down to 21% at max, and it's even less than that. So basically, we've got a situation where we've got a big difference. So people that are filing 1120Hs are paying more taxes generally, if they're paying tax. So so you want to leave that flexibility in a pooled situation. Almost all of these associations have gone to pools, aren't pulling out their maintenance items, so they're left with no choice. And so what's going to happen is, as interest rates go up and they start having to pay tax on their interest income, they're going to say, well, why are we paying so much tax? We don't have to pay tax. We're a nonprofit. Well, no, you're not. So then you start looking at it, and you find out you're paying 30%. They say, why are we paying 30%? Well, because you're filing 1120H. Well, don't file an 1120H. File the other one. Well, I can't because you got pooled reserves and you put your maintenance items in there. So that's what's coming down the road, and it's going to be kind of nasty. So that's the thing that should be pulled out. But otherwise, you don't want to pull the other items out because it. And I'll tell you why. You would think it would be more conservative to do that, but it's kind of exactly the opposite. If you end up with an overage and you missed in one account and you grossly missed under on the other account, so you got a shortage, you now can't offset those. So you can't allow for mistakes. At least in the pool, if you underestimate an item or overestimate an item and you're kind of doing your best and you're consistent, those will kind of come out where you're going to overestimate some items and you'll underestimate some items, and you kind of want them all in the same pool so that when you correct the mistake, it doesn't have as much of an impact. But anyway, that's all.
Yeah, I know. I understand. It's the flexibility, and it's nice to have that flexibility. But the problem is we have 4 major items coming up in the next 2 to 3 years. And painting is our 3rd largest reserve item.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you mentioned that. Thank you very much, because I was unaware of that. But we're going to have to do the roofs. We're going to have to do the painting. And while all this is going on over the next 3 years, they want to do the elevators. So with the pool, like Peter says, you got to be pretty precise about this.
Yes,
and if you're not, and if all 3 come due or 4 come due at one time, you're not going to be able to rob Peter to pay Paul without doing a special assessment.
No, you're right. So you're right.
But thank you very much. That one last thing, if you do stick with the straight line, because it's very hard to get 66% of owners to change these things. But if you stick with the straight line, isn't the easiest thing to do if you're a property manager, for instance, for roofs, is just ask roofers to come over and give you an estimate? I mean, is it that hard?
Yes, it is. It is. That's not the way to do it, because, and that's the way you get bad numbers. All right.
Okay.
Because they have a dog in the fight. You really
get
an independent.
Well, aren't they going to overestimate?
No.
They're going to overestimate?
No. Here's what they're going to do. There's 2 things that they're going to do, there's 2 things that you do when you don't want to do when you get estimates. One is you don't want to use the last time it was done. Roofs are a good example. The last time it was done, it may have been done after a hurricane. The price for roofing was 3 times what it was if you had it done in a non-hurricane. So if you use that number, there's no way in heck it's going to be that high. Okay.
Well, plus it may have been. I mean, it may have been 15 or 20 years ago.
Well, that's true. But even if it was recent, if it was after a hurricane, those prices are going to be completely different. But as Peter was getting at, and is why you don't call them out, if they don't think you're doing the roof anytime soon, if they think this is 12 years, 10 years, whatever down the road, they either won't come out, or the qualified ones won't come out because they're busy doing other stuff, or they will throw you a lowball quote because they know they're not going to have to live by it because they're not going to do it right away. So they'll throw you a quote that's way under, 10, 20, 30% under what they think, because they know by the time they come out 10 years from now or 8 years from now, they can change it and say, well, it's inflation, that was 10 years ago or whatever. So that's the problem. You do not get a good number. The best numbers are from engineers usually. Some of the reserve specialists that do these calculations do have sources. They've got people that will give them good prices because they do use them a lot. They pay them and they recommend them. And there are people that know what the market is and know what the prices are. But for your property manager to call around and get 3 roofers to come out, first of all, you won't get them to come out because they're too busy right now. Most of them are down south still. And second of all, if they do give you a price, they want the work, so they'll give you a lowball price, knowing they don't have to live with it. So
also, John, normally, you did say this twice, so I was going to jump in here. Normally, the vote to create a pool is not 66% or 2/3. It's actually usually it's a much lower vote. It's a majority of a quorum, typically, unless your documents have some specific provision.
They're written in our declarations, and our declarations to change them is 2/3. But thank you for bringing that up. They tried to shove us. They tried to allow trucks and motorcycles would come in here, and that was that lower threshold, and they couldn't even get enough to pass that lower threshold. We haven't had an annual meeting in 20 years, and I've been here 25. So it's really hard to get people to vote for anything, let alone an annual membership meeting to get a quorum in here, which is only 1/3 of 33%. But thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it.
Now,
and thank you guys for all your great information.
Okay.
There's a lot of stuff I learned today.
Well, no problem. We appreciate the call, John. Thanks a lot.
Have a great day.
Thank you, John.
You too.
You too.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Bye. So Peter, one of the things that came up there at the end was the vote situation. And I don't remember on this, but I thought that a board can establish, can adopt the pooling method going forward, but they can't transfer in the balances unless the members approve it.
Well, that's what I meant. If you already have, in my view, if you have a straight line and you're going to a pool, I think you need an owner vote. If you have nothing and you're just creating reserves, let's say you've been waiving them for years or something, I don't know, and then you want to create reserves, then you can just create them as pooled.
What if
But if you're transferring money, in my view, if you're transferring money from a straight line to a pool, you're in essence changing use.
right?
That's why you need the vote.
And I agree. And I mean, that's what I've.
But from that point forward, you can just fund it as a pool. You don't have to vote every year.
Well, no, but what I was getting at, I agree with that. I mean, I've always heard that too. That if you transfer your straight line balances into the pool, then you have to have a member vote. But I think, and this is for John's benefit, because I understood that one way that boards have been getting around this is they go ahead and vote to adopt the pooling method, but they don't transfer. They keep the other assets, the other pooled or the other items on the straight line method until they've used them up. So they have, for a time period.
Oh, you have two different reserve accounts? Then
Yes.
you have a straight line,
Yes.
and then they create a pool?
Yes. So they create the pool going forward so that they can get the advantage of the reduced funding going
I guess
forward.
they could do that, but they're going to have to somehow calculate all that together. Okay. Yeah.
And then
I guess they could.
Then what they do is that, they can't technically add the straight line numbers to the, but what they do is, they're figuring in, they know that they've got money already set aside partially. And so, and they're not creating, they're just starting the pooling method going forward with nothing in it.
I've never seen that because I have two different reserve accounts.
Uh-huh.
I don't know, but so you're adding that to your balance? All right.
Yeah,
I mean,
I've seen a couple.
I haven't seen it, but I guess it's theoretically possible.
Yeah, and I've seen it happen because I've seen. I saw a couple of associations that they knew they couldn't get the vote, so they left the straight lines, and then they just started going forward with a pooling method. And then as those straight line accounts were depleted, now everything was
added them to their pool account.
In effect, they stopped funding them on a straight line basis and started funding them on a pool.
Right, they're funding them on the pool.
Yep. So anyway,
they threw them in. Okay.
Yeah. So that's how I've seen people get around it. So they don't physically calculate it, but they leave it out there, and then typically what they do is they waive the funding of the, try to get a waiver on the other. But anyway, they just let it go. I'm glad John called because, as you know, I hate these pooled reserves, but they've become, almost a given with these associations. All you have to do is tell anybody, any board, well, this will result.
It'll cost you less.
It'll
right.
cost
They'll
you,
say it'll cost you less to get to the same place.
Yeah.
Theoretically.
Well, that's what they tell them, and which is not true. It's going to cost you the same amount, but you're going to pay less over.
That's what I meant. It'll cost you less each year. Now, when I say cost you less, now each item obviously costs the same to do. I mean, we're not in. This is not magic. But when I say less being contributed every year to still be quote fully funded unquote.
Right.
But as you say, there's so many moving parts. All those stars have to be aligned, and for that full funding to actually work.
Oh yeah.
Under the pool.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because, like you say, um, technically, you should end up with kind of the same answer. You should end up with a situation where the pooling and the straight line method, definitely cost wise, they should be the same costs. And if you fund them out over the period of time, um, all they're doing is theoretically all they're doing is leveling them out, leveling your payment out, so you don't have a situation where you've got to make a big payment up front because, let's say your roof is a 20-year life and you've got, 5 years left. Well, if it's straight line, you got to fund that out over 5 years. But if I put it in the pool, I can use the money I've got in my painting reserve because I don't have to paint yet. I can use my, for my balconies. I can use all.
Well, you have money sitting there. Well, I guess theoretically is in a straight line, you have a lot of money sitting there, quote, not doing anything, unquote, until that item comes up.
Right.
And in the pool, it's the same amount of money for each thing, but you don't have the money, quote, sitting there doing nothing because everything,
Right.
not everything, but a lot of it's being used for each thing. I mean, we're not. The best way to look at this, and on the radio it's hard, is on a chart where you can physically see how that pool works or theoretically works, so that you're putting in less every year, but are still fully funded. But like I said, it's very susceptible to your estimates being right.
Right.
To me, that's the biggest thing that throws it off.
Yeah, and that's the only thing is that is that if you calculate it correctly, it should come out. All it's doing is leveling it out. So, like you say,
right,
if you've got money sitting in your painting reserve that you're not going to need for another 15 years, then you can use it for some other stuff and then fund it. Later when those items are taken care of, you can fund it. Use some of that cash to refund it basically down the road without a balloon payment. But that's why the state doesn't, of course, want a balloon payment, because otherwise you'd use all the money that was in there, and then when it came time to do the roof, you'd have no money. And of course, roof is what always gets underestimated. Sometimes it gets overestimated. Like I said, I've seen associations that did their reserve calculation based on a reserve replacement that occurred after the hurricane and after the 2004 hurricanes, and those numbers were not anywhere near what you would have to pay if you did them when you needed to do it instead of after a hurricane. So anyway, but I wish the state would do something on. The other thing is, at least John's Association sounds like they had a reserve study done. That's nice. That's the other thing. Most of this stuff is just a shot in the dark. I'll call up my local contractor and he'll tell me how much it is. And that's what we're talking about. That's why it's so difficult, because they don't have time to give prices to go out and do a real estimate to determine, because it takes them a lot of time to do that. So anyway, it's a good question. It was good. A good way to start off the show is in terms of, or take a little time during the show to talk about some of this stuff. The Fannie Mae Freddie Mac stuff is interesting too. But I did hear, I didn't mention it before, but I have heard that, believe it or not, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were going to loosen up on that 25% requirement. They had been pushing very hard. And so, at 40% rentals, it's possible that that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac still may approve something there. But I've heard that they were trying to move off the 25%. Maybe they are looking at doing, allowing a higher level if the reserves are funded or whatever, if they have adequate reserves. But I do know they won't fund without the 10% contribution, and which is crazy, because, like I said, that's just a rule of thumb that doesn't necessarily work. If you have a prudent association that's already funded a reserve item like their roof, and let's say they have straight lines, so they've got the roof funded, and maybe even painting, and so now all they've got is some small reserve accounts, they're going to drop their reserve funding way down. Why not? And they're probably not going to drop their total funding. They're probably going to, if they do it right, they'll put some money through operating and and boost up some of their operating balances. But still, they're going to, they're not going to have 10% in their they're not going to have 10% in their reserve portion. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, they're a government agency. They don't really look at anything other than what they got a little rule book and people check stuff off. I've never met an underwriter that really fully understands condos and homeowners associations, but particularly condos. So we'll see what happens there. But it sounds like another disaster. I appreciate John's. I'm even as an investor, because I invest, I like the reserves to have to be paid. I like them to have reserves. I like that you have to collect reserves because I don't want surprises. I don't want somebody to come to me and say, we got a $10,000 special assessment or a $4,000 special assessment. I don't want to do that because then I'm going to have to go out and refinance probably because I don't have all kinds of cash sitting around. I've already put that cash into some other investment, So it's interesting. I think a lot of good investors are on the side of John on this. They want adequate reserves. They don't want to have to deal with. Now, if they think they can get away with no reserves and then they'll sell the unit before they have to pay for anything, maybe that's it. But that's Russian roulette with reserves. I wouldn't want to be on that end of the bullet. I've seen too many people have to face that when they thought they weren't going to have to. So anyway, but in fact, I bought a unit one time that had a special assessment that was going to come for the roof. It was laid out ahead of time. So naturally I paid less for that unit than it would have because I knew that was going to have to be paid. And the problem with underfunded reserves from an investment standpoint is people will think it's underfunded, even if maybe they think maybe if the association isn't really underfunded or, has been providing, they're going to think it's underfunded and they're going to adjust their price anyway. If they don't think that there's adequate reserves there, they're going to adjust what they're going to pay. So, because nobody wants a special assessment. Anyway, so that was kind of an interesting one. What, we're kind of running out at the end of the hour now. We got about 3 minutes left. So not much time to get into some other things, but I would mention for the listeners that, that's a good example. John's got an issue there and, it was great for him to call us and give us an opportunity to talk about it and, get it out there. So, make sure that
that's an issue that every condo association just needs to deal with.
Yes.
Because every association by law needs to budget for reserves. And then, as you mentioned, on an annual basis, they can vote to waive the funding or partially fund. And they can also have a choice, as you said, between the straight line method of funding or the pooled method, both of which are also susceptible to being waived or partially funded. So it is an issue that is not just some theoretical whatever. It is an issue of everyday budgeting for every condo association in the state.
Yeah, and John mentioned he had seen some other situations, and we were talking about how those don't usually exist in the condo world, but they do exist in the HOA world, and we don't have time to really get into the HOA situation, but there's a different environment because there's a different types. There's statutory and non-statutory reserves.
Yeah, the HOA. Yeah, I didn't want to get into that right now because it is so different in terms of which ones have to fund reserves and which ones don't. And just in the short time we have left, it's just going to create some confusion. But just be aware, I guess anyone who's listening, that the HOA reserve requirements in terms of which HOAs have to fund reserves is completely different. So, but we can touch on it.
No, and that's
some other time.
And that's true. That is one of the things.
But basically, real quick, just so people aren't going to scratch their heads. For our HOAs, the ones that have to have reserves are those that have created them or that had them from day one. In other words, the developer had it in the original budgets on forward, or if the owners vote in, by an affirmative vote by the membership to create the reserves. Other than that, those are the two statutory reserves.
Yeah.
Everything else is pretty much discretionary by the board.
Yeah, and I think or
the documents. Excuse me, or the documents.
Yeah,
board documents too.
And also I think there was a couple court cases a year ago or so dealing with the HOA reserves that kind of made things a little bit more tight on that side. So maybe we can talk about that a little next week. But like I said, we're here for you. So whatever you want to talk about, tell your friends, call in, 220-9788, 220-WSTU. That's the number. Write it down. It's good for our show and for a number of other shows. So let people know, and we'll be here every Monday from 9 to 10 o'clock right here on WSTU Digital 1450. We are Martin County's Heritage Station.